Recording actual overhead. As I mentioned before, applied overhead costs are recorded on job sheets. That is applied or estimated overhead costs. Now we're talking about actual overhead costs. These actual overhead costs are not recorded on the job cost sheets because the estimated costs are already there. The actual overhead costs are found on different types of source documents. So think about the different types of overhead. That'd be indirect materials, indirect labor, utilities. So indirect material, that amount, that cost, comes from materials requisition forms. Indirect labor costs come from salary contracts or time tickets. And then the other overhead costs, things like utilities, that would come from a power bill or payments for rent or other things for the factory like supplies. Also includes depreciation expense. So there are source documents to show actual amounts of these items that make up overhead. So remember that non-manufacturing costs, such as advertising, sales commissions, those are not overhead. Those are period costs. So we are only looking at product costs. So now to record the actual overhead used. Each time we record actual overhead, it will be a debit to the overhead account. Anything that was estimated was a credit to factory overhead. So now that we are recording actual costs, they will be debited to factory overhead. So first, with indirect materials, you debit factory overhead and credit raw materials inventory. Then for indirect labor, you'll again debit factory overhead and credit factory wages payable. And then other overhead costs besides indirect materials and indirect labor will be recorded in another journal entry where all of those can be accumulated into one factory overhead entry. So again, since you are recording actual overhead costs, you debit factory overhead for that total amount that you're recording, and then credit each of those individual accounts for those costs. Remember that actual overhead costs are not recorded as part of work in process, and they are not posted to job cost sheets. This is applied or estimated overhead that's recorded in work in process and posted to job cost sheets. So since that has already been done, now that the actual costs can be calculated and recorded, they are within the overhead account. So only applied or estimated overhead is recorded in work in process and posted to job cost sheets. Actual costs are not. Now an example of recording the actual overhead journal entry. A manufacturing company used $400 of indirect materials and $2,000 of indirect labor during the period. The company also incurred $1,200 for depreciation on factory equipment and $300 for factory utilities. Prepare the journal entry to record actual overhead costs. When we are recording actual costs, we debit factory overhead, and we credit all of the other accounts that correspond to those other costs. So here we see $400 of indirect materials. That would be a credit to raw materials inventory. A credit of $400. Then we see $2,000 of indirect labor. So that would be some type of, in terms of the source document, it would be some type of time ticket, and that would need to be recorded to factory wages payable. So we credit factory wages payable. And that amount is $2,000. Next, $1,200 for depreciation. So that will be accumulated depreciation. And this is specifically for assets in the factory. So not any computer equipment or things like that that are in the office. Those are recorded in a different way. For recording factory overhead, we're only looking at things that are specific to the factory. So that amount for accumulated depreciation was $1,200, and then $300 for factory utilities. So the account that we would use for that would be utilities payable, and that would be a credit also. $300. So those are all the credit amounts. So you want to add all of those up to get your debit for factory overhead. When you add up all those credits, it comes out to $3,900. So that is what you need to debit factory overhead. And that's how you record the actual overhead costs.